Okay, great. So here we are for our May Water Supply Availability Committee meeting. And quick agenda overview. First, I'm going to recap our current drought declaration and what that process looks like and where we are in that process and implications for a drought declaration. Then we'll have Karen with the Washington State Climate Office for our overall regional climate setting. And Matt with NRCS could not make it today, but I do have some slides for him that I am going to share. Then we'll have Nick with USGS on streamflow and groundwater, and Teresa from Borough of Reclamation, who will now be our representative for Mick Luecke, who is no longer with Reclamation. She could not make it today, also had a conflict, but I will share a brief update around the Yakima project and reclamation forecasting. And then we'll have Amy Burke with the Northwest River Forecast Center. And then after presentations, we will have a hydrologic threshold discussion on if additional areas have met the state's drought declaration hydrologic threshold for potentially recommending next steps in the drought declaration process. And then again, WASEC provides an important role to ecology to advise on current and forecasted water supply conditions. And when we're approaching drought conditions, whether that hydrologic threshold for drought has been met or is likely to be met. And for today, we'll be assessing water conditions as we are in spring and nearing summer for water year 2025. And again, discuss if current hydrologic conditions warrant recommending ecology convene next steps in the state drought declaration process. And to recap, back in April, ecology declared a drought declaration, and the Yakima basins, Kittitas and Upper Yakima, Lower Yakima, and Naches, due to low reservoir storage and compounding snowpack and precipitation deficits, as well as issued a drought advisory in the counties you see here for watersheds across Whatcom, Skagit, Snohomish, King, Pierce, Chelan, and Okanagan. And I want to highlight that an advisory is saying the conditions have not yet been met, but there are concerning conditions that may lead to drought conditions. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. And so again, here in Washington, we talk about drought conditions in our state statute. That specifically means two thresholds have been met. One, this hydrologic threshold, that an area is receiving or is projected to receive less than 75% of a normal water supply. And we say normal in this context, we're referring to the 30-year average of the period from 1991 to 2020. And then second, we have a hardship threshold that water users and the environment are expected or to experience undue hardship from these hydrologic conditions in this water year. And in terms of the phrase water supply, there's not one way that we look at or measure water supply. There are a number of different factors that go into that. There are, of course, snowpack, precipitation, temperature, soil moisture, stream flow forecasts, and as well as the water year to date and forecast for those different water supply factors.
Supporting this work in part has been on.
Great. And when we talk about a drought declaration, that means two specific things for the state of Washington. First, that ecology can expedite the processing of emergency water transfer and drought permit applications. But I always like to emphasize that all the other requirements are still in place, including mitigation. Just means that ecology can process in 15 days. And then second, a drought declaration triggers opening up specific drought emergency response funds for ecology to support public entities in addressing the hardships or drought impacts from these current drought conditions. And again, that's about responding to emergency situations. And just to highlight again with a drought advisory, that specifically means that drought conditions have not yet developed, but they're indicators that drought conditions may develop. And this is a public awareness and readiness tool, particularly for small public entities that may need more time to brainstorm or figure out what types of projects they may want to do if they were to be brought under a drought declaration. And again, drought relief tools are not available under an advisory. But similar to a drought declaration with an advisory, it's highlighting that if there were to be a drought declaration, that there could be multiple different types of drought impacts. And when we talk about drought response grants, those are eligible to these tribes and public entities, including cities, counties, water and sewer districts, and as well as conservation districts, irrigation districts, and water management partnerships. And as a further, under a drought declaration, ecology can use drought response funding for interagency agreements to support other state agencies to respond to drought in ways that they're uniquely positioned to respond, as well as opens up eligibility for some federal funding and serves as an important communications tool, especially as we're seeing these drought patterns and conditions on increasing frequencies for the Yakima basins and now potentially other basins, being the third year in a row of meeting our state's drought conditions definition. And just always some quick example projects for folks that ask. We talk about drought response funds. In the past year, we've had irrigation districts use a grant to support the leasing of water from another irrigation district and from a water bank. In 2023, we had a small public utility use funds for trucking of water for a small stream that serves a small community that can dry up in drought years later in the summer. And we can also support the fisheries work, including with Department of Fish and Wildlife for eliminating migration barriers that may be built during the summer and supporting passage of fish during these drought years where flows may dry up earlier than they otherwise would. Great. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and make sure Karen has permission for screen sharing.
Nope.
And one moment, Karen, just want to make sure you've got the right permissions here. And then we'll come back to you for the hydrologic threshold discussion after presentations. Thank you, Karen.
How's that look?
Wonderful.
Okay, great. Thanks, Caroline. So I'm just going to dive in to the update on our current conditions and the seasonal outlook. I did put in a couple slides about snowpack that I'll queue up for Matt's, but I am disappointed he's not going to be here to discuss it with us. Okay, so looking at the water year, the maps on the top are going through the 5th of May, so just early this week. Starting back in October, temperature on the left-hand side is showing anomaly, so all of that red area is warmer than normal. And averaged across the state, October through April was slightly above normal, just shy of 1 degree Fahrenheit above normal. But because we've seen long-term warming in our region and our state, that does rank as the 21st warmest October through April on record, and that's going all the way back to 1895. So definitely on the warm side for the water year as a whole so far. Precipitation is on the right, percent of normal, and we can see below normal precipitation still showing up mainly west of the Cascades, including the Cascade Mountains, and above normal precipitation in eastern Washington for the water year as a whole. If you average that out statewide, it's kind of a wash, and it just comes to near normal precipitation for the water year so far at 93% of normal. So I went ahead and I looked up, so Washington State can be separated into 10 different climate divisions, and there's 2 that encompass the Cascade Mountains. One is on the west side called the Cascade Mountain West Division, and one encompasses more of the east slopes of the Cascades, the east slope, it's called East Slopes Cascades appropriately. So I looked up that precipitation from October through April, and for both of those climate divisions, they're sitting at about 88% of normal precipitation for the water year as a whole. This is taking a look since January because conditions have been different since January, and it contradict a little bit the picture you get if you look at the water year as a whole. So the majority of the warmth that we saw for the water year occurred in those earlier months, October through December. So if you look just since January, we're pretty near normal for the state. Even some pockets of blue popping up, which is between 1 to 2 degrees below normal from January through April. Precipitation, you're also getting a little more of a different story where some parts of eastern Washington are showing up with below normal precipitation since January 1st. If you average across the state, January through April was about 78% of normal, so just above our threshold for what we would consider part of a drought declaration. I looked up again these two climate divisions, and here the Cascade Mountain West over here is just at 77% of normal, so very similar to the state as a whole. And then the East Slope Cascades, where you're seeing some of these darker colors, that's coming in at 71% of normal, so below normal there. I also went ahead and just did some masking so we can see a little clearer where in the state we've had below 75% of normal precipitation. For the water year as a whole, these brown areas are pretty limited to parts along the eastern part of the Cascade Crest. Since January 2025, there's a more of the state that has less than 75% of normal precipitation. And here in these advisory areas that we have called out earlier in April, those are looking worse in terms of precipitation since January 1 compared to the ones on the west slopes of the Cascades. So then April was warm and dry. We did see a little bit of relief in March. Unfortunately, it wasn't long-lived, it was short-lived. Average statewide April temperatures were about the 25th warmest, tied the 25th warmest on record for the state, almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit above normal, and really seeing that warmth almost everywhere except for southeastern Washington. Precipitation also on the dry side, especially here on the coast and in the southern Cascades. And I'm sorry, I just realized I pulled the anomaly, not the percent of normal. So usually I show this as percent of normal. This is showing the actual anomaly in inches. But average statewide, our April precipitation was 57% of normal, ranking as the 30th driest. So I'm sure some of you have 2021 still in mind. It was fairly recent. We had an extremely dry spring. And April of 2021 was only 30% of normal precipitation averaged across the state. So while we've had a dry April, it wasn't as bad as 2021, just as a little marker to put that in perspective. We've been talking a little bit about some long-term precipitation deficits around Washington. Of course, we've had drought declarations fairly frequently in recent years. This is looking at the Standardized Precipitation and Evapotranspiration Index. It's a drought monitor, a drought indicator long term. So this is going back 36 months. So from May of 2022 to April of 2025. And here these kind of red colors are showing that the dryness that we're seeing this year in kind of the North and Central Cascades has been persisting for longer than that. So this is an area that we've seen a couple years in a row now where we've had below normal precipitation. And this SPEI index has an evapotranspiration part taken into account. And so it takes into account temperatures as well. All right, so US Drought Monitor, this was just released this morning. Some abnormally dry has been added recently. This is the change from the last 4 weeks. There was some improvement in part of the D1 that may have been a little jumping the gun in terms of some early April precipitation. Of course, we know April turned out to be drier than normal and drier than expected. So I do expect to see the improvements, what's the word for it? Shifting from improvements and more to degradation based on what the month as a whole has been. This is popping up percent of median, of course, that Matt usually talks about. This is just at the end of the day on May 6th. And I do want to caution, these numbers are looking really low, but at this time of year, we already do have some of these sites that have melted out completely. So it does drag down our basin average percent of median SWE quite a bit. So I think it would be prudent for us to look at individual SNOTEL sites to see, how far they're how far into the melt season they are. But from this snapshot, we are seeing below median snowpack really across all those areas that we had issued the advisory for, in numbers dropping where the declaration was already made as well. I did want to pull up just two, let me highlight them here. So in the next slide, I have the Central Columbia Basin and the Olympic Basin averaged out, looking at those basin traces. So this is the Central Columbia in the top, and you can see here that we're seeing some melt quicker than what we would normally like to see. The slope of this line is a bit has a more of a drop off than if it were just kind of following this normal curve. So that is also playing a role into why we're seeing the drop in percentage of median. For the Olympic Peninsula, this one is also melting a little bit quicker than normal, but still thankfully in this normal band here, which I think is a good sign there. Of course, dependent on how the rest of the month's temperatures go. So El Nino, La Nina, right now we're in a neutral phase. We have no ENSO alert that is active. And this was also just released this morning, so getting lots of fresh data today. This is showing the probabilities of either outcome going into the next few seasons. We're feeling extremely confident that for spring and into the summer, the ENSO status will remain neutral. So it doesn't really have a big impact on our weather. Over here on the right-hand side, we can see that there's really no anomaly in either direction along the equatorial Pacific Ocean, which is where we measure the strength of La Nina or El Nino. So this is totally fitting with the neutral conditions. I did want to note that there is something called the spring forecast barrier in forecasting El Nino or La Nina for the following winter. So right now it's looking like next fall and winter, there's about it's a toss up between whether we'll see another La Nina or another neutral year. So in May, those forecasts start to improve for further on. So they're better than they were in April, but we'll really see a lot more skill in those forecasts in July and August. So we'll have a better idea later in summer what it'll look like for fall and winter next year. Looking at May, really not an indication either way on how the month's going to go. Of course, the first week of May has been fairly dry, but there's some higher odds of above normal temperatures persisting or existing through all of May on far eastern Washington, and then a slight chance of above normal precipitation over here, which is good news, but otherwise not a lot of not telling us much either way in how the month's precipitation will turn out. And I should also say that there are some, Amy can probably speak to this way better than I can when she talks about the 10-day forecast, but it does look like we should see some precipitation, kind of middle of May for some of those 6 to 10 day, 8 to 14 day outlooks. But Amy, I'd love to hear more. This is looking further out. This is the National Multi-Model Ensemble, so a seasonal forecast model, an average of all of them, telling us what our June through August temperatures will look like, and pretty strong indication that we're expecting a warmer than normal summer. This is the international model over here on the bottom, which is pretty consistent with the national model. They have different seasonal forecast models that go into each of those systems. This is the same thing, but for precipitation, and also a majority of the models are showing drier than normal June through August precipitation. Of course, we don't normally expect to see a lot of precipitation that time of year, but this is saying drier than our usual dry. And the Climate Prediction Center is going with those seasonal forecast models and some of the other guidance that they use to come up with their June, July, August forecast of higher odds of above normal temperatures and below normal precipitation. So just to summarize, average statewide, our water year temperatures have been slightly above normal. When you look at just since January, that warm signal drops away a bit. So really the drought situation that we're in this year has been driven mostly by lack of precipitation rather than warm temperatures. Precipitation for the water year has been near normal, but there's regional variations. It's been below normal for Western Washington, including the Cascade Mountains. precipitation since January 1st has been low almost throughout the entire state and especially low on the east slopes of the Cascades. April was warm and dry. La Nina or neutral is the most likely outcome for next winter. Regardless, there's little impact on our summer weather. But beyond that, we're expecting to see above normal or higher chances of warmer and drier than normal June, July, and August.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. Any quick questions for Karen? Yeah, really appreciate the different perspectives there and some of the different data you showed. Actually, Karen, I've got a quick question for you. If you could pull up your slides again. I'm going back to one of the ones that you showed today that you haven't shown recently. In terms of, like, there was the evapotranspiration, one of the precipitation ones, kind of earlier on. Keep going back. Yes, this one here, since January. I'm curious, I just wanted to have you show this one again. I'm thinking about this little arm that's reaching out in Eastern Washington and seeing where that, and if you could, I was thinking which counties those go in, that little arm goes into. Yeah,
this
over
one down
there.
here?
Yep, exactly.
Oh, you're testing me. Is this the one Adams, Lincoln?
Mhm. Anyway, I should appreciate looking at that one a little closer.
Okay.
And because yeah, I think that's this really interesting piece of how we break apart the water year and what that means for lack of precipitation in different areas.
And I think there's been a little bit more of a better appreciation that the precipitation we received in October, I mean, that's gone. That's totally run off already and not really a big player into what we're seeing right now. So that's why I didn't randomly pick since January 1st. It just is the more recent time period.
Yeah, well, I think it makes sense in terms of more recent. And then also, since we had a drier than normal January, I think it's important to understand what were the impacts of that drier than normal January. Now we've also had this drier than normal April.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, I think it's helpful to see these, to see that those impacts are different in different parts of the state. There's not one answer across the entire state. Great, thank you. And now I'm going to share my screen and share some of Matt's slides he had prepared, even though he couldn't make it. And then after that, we will go to Nick. So one moment. Okay, so here we go, pretending we are Matt. So first, just a general overview of a statewide snowpack. But again, as Karen showed, there's still a fair amount of variability statewide. Even if statewide, we are now down to 69% of normal. And here we are seeing some record and near record melting in some parts of the state for April. Some of the warmer temps in April contributed to higher rates of snowmelt than normal at several SNOTEL stations. In some cases, the melt rate was at or near a record high. And so again, like Karen said, at some places across the state, this is starting to be melt-off season. But what's of note here is places that are melting off earlier or faster than normal. And so we see here these reds, these are these lowest, and then the oranges, we've got some second lowest, and to the North Cascades and to the Wenatchee, sort of Chelan area here, excuse me, as well as over in the Dungeness, Elwha area. Great. And then in terms of overall snowpack and the degradation we've seen since April 1st, again, we have seen warmer temperatures and a lack of precipitation. And these snow drought conditions have worsened in portions of central and northern Cascades. So we definitely see that exhibited here, comparing the April 1st to the May 6th of this week. And since, again, these numbers are not just saying it's spring, this is saying compared to normal for this time of year. In terms of water year peak snowpack, is mostly below normal this season, except for a few stations near the south part of Mount Rainier. So we do see kind of this line here where if you're northeast of Rainier, things are not looking good. If you're southeast of Rainier, snowpack is still looking better. And in terms of the meltout, stations without snow melted out earlier than normal in most cases, with several stations in the Puget Sound Basin melting out 14 to 33 days earlier than normal. Now, most of those are lower elevation stations, but that also includes the Salmon Meadows snowtel in the Upper Columbia, despite above normal peak snowpack melted out 10 days earlier than normal. So you see some of these numbers here are kind of small. We see 22 days earlier over here, 33 days earlier than normal in the Central Cascades, as well as 14 days earlier than normal in terms of the meltout. And in terms of precipitation, again, seeing general statewide precipitation, while at 87% statewide, we have had a lot of variability, as Karen talked about. And for month-to-date precipitation, again, except for very early April, as we all experienced, the month was quite dry. May starting off dry, some questions for the next 10 days. But as Amy will share more of, I'm not expecting any miracles to happen. And so again, we see going from April now to May, get in red in most parts of the state, except for the Olympics overall. And in terms of water year-to-date precipitation, as Karen was saying, this one is since October, but we are seeing below normal precipitation for all major basins in April led to degradation in water year-to-date precipitation across the state, further exacerbating persistent and pervasive deficits in several basins. And now comparing to compounding deficits over multi-year periods, now again looking at Yakima Basin that is currently in the state's drought declaration. This is showing precipitation deficits over the last decade, October 2014 through May of 2025 over here. And looking at the Upper Yakima, Lower Yakima, and Naches basins, there are greater deficits in Naches and Lower Yakima basins, and deficits expanded to new lows in April for the Naches and Lower Yakima basin. So still, while those areas are in our drought declaration, still really helpful to see what the continued April has had for impacts. And for soil moisture, compared to April 1st, there are general indications that root zone soils have dried out quite rapidly in southwestern Washington and the lower Snake and Walla Walla basins. What that will mean, still questions in terms of impacts. But again, soil moisture is always a helpful indicator for what happens when we do get some precipitation. And wrapping up here with our share from NRCS in terms of water supply forecasts, the outlook has degraded from April 1st to May 1st, with mostly below normal water supply forecasts, except for a few points in Lower Columbia and Mill Creek and the Walla Walla Basin. And overall, in terms of areas of concern that Matt saw, definitely emphasizing Lake Chelan, Intiet, and Wenatchee basins, as well as Elwha and Dungeness, that we'll talk more about later. And in other areas, despite fairly good snowpack in the lower Wenatchees this summer, rapid melt-off in April had a considerable adverse impact to the water supply outlook in the Wenatchee area, as well as in the Okanagan. The water supply outlook since April has been below normal across the Okanagan Basin. With recent rapid melt-off, conditions have worsened a bit, with continued concern for later season water supply and base flows. All right, and with that, I'm going to stop the share of these slides from Matt, and we will pass it over to Nick.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Nick Sutphin from the Washington Water Science Center, USGS Surface Water Specialist here. And I want to make sure you can all see let's see here. I'm going to share my screen first. Make sure you can see this. All right, can you see my presentation?
Yes, thank you.
All right, great. Yep. Just starting off with a picture here. I just changed from last month. Nathan Esch here doing some surveying on Lake Chelan. So certainly pertinent this time of year, thinking about water storage. So starting off as usual, the 7-day average stream flow across the state at all of our gauges is kind of mixed, as you can see, everywhere, spanning from record lows to just a few highs in the blue and the dark blue. But the western part of the state certainly jumps out as being much below and below normal stream flow conditions at our gauges. Other than that, it's largely kind of normal conditions with the exception of the southeast down there by Walla Walla. So we'll zoom in then to these 8 index gauges that we normally look at. And doing that, we can see a similar trend where it's dry in the west, where we have these much below normal and record low on the southwest part of the state in Chehalis and the East Fork Lewis River, and the Puyallup and Quinault being below normal. The only normal gauge of these index gauges is the North Fork Nooksack, likely because of early snow melt, as we'll see kind of in some other plots as well, and dry in the east here at Hangman and Walla Walla. So this same 7-day average now, looking at the area weighted watersheds across the state, show the same trend with some wetter conditions there just on the east side of the Cascades, up in the Chelan and Matau basins. And then, just as we saw before, really dry in the southwest, Lake Roosevelt being much below normal or record lows really for the 7-day average this time of year. Looking at this plot that we normally view, the percentage of our USGS stream gauges here on the vertical axis, and then with 45 days going across the horizontal axis, this black dotted line shows the median of our USGS stream gauges. So we can see this kind of wetter March that we had that kind of carried into the beginning of April. We had and then in the middle of April, we had a lot more of our gauges were flowing above normal, likely because of that warming and that earlier snowpack or snow melt. And then kind of we're still at about normal, but you're getting really close to being below normal with our stream gauges. And then this plot on the right is very similar, but just showing this red line as an index, showing if we're above or below normal, and shows that kind of wetter March and April with regard to stream flow, then coming down now below normal conditions, or just a little lower than normal, sorry. So continuing with the 7-day average, but now looking at this runoff hydrograph, again, area based, just like the plots or the maps that we look at for the watersheds, are this dark black line being current conditions. So showing in this wetter kind of March and April with regard to stream flow again, reiterating that we didn't, Karen showing that we didn't have a whole lot of precipitation there, but that snow melt bringing us into much higher flow conditions in late March and into April. And so now we've dipped below normal and are kind of on a small rising trend right now, potentially because of the warm conditions we've had recently and more melting. So then kind of looking at just this year on the right-hand side, that same hydrograph, comparing it to some of our recent drought years here. We are kind of, it seems to be a trend at the beginning of May with some of these drought years where we are kind of getting below normal at a lot of these. There's some exceptions, but with this really strong drought year in 2001 where we actually kind of rose above normal. But the difference being that we had this wetter March and April compared to kind of some of the trends in the past drought. But again, that's not necessarily great because that is likely because of that early snow melt. Monthly average stream flow, just to step back and remind us, January was pretty wet, as Karen was also mentioning, and then February, that dryness carried on to February when we usually get, have quite a bit of precipitation. Then looking now into March, what we looked at last time as well, and now April, we kind of had those wet conditions across the state and much of the state in March, particularly the western part of the state. And in April, we're starting to see, we saw some more kind of drying out of the stream flow, but still normal to much above normal. The Roosevelt Basin still being much below normal here. And then we have the Upper Columbia and Anaat and the Methow and some of these other basins, Natchez, and all being above normal conditions in April. Likely, as I mentioned, is the recurring theme of increased early snow melt. Compare this just to last April. We're at a bit of more stream flow this April than last April, particularly in the western part of the state. So now looking at that here with these drought years as well, like we did with those hydrographs, comparing visually these area weighted monthly averages. April of this year here in the lower right, we are in a bit of, it certainly seems like it was wetter. It was a wetter April with regard to stream flow than most of these drought years, potentially with the exception of 2019, where we had high stream flow conditions in the southern part of the state. So now looking at the cumulative runoff hydrograph, this year on the right here, 2019 on the left, we're sitting right at about normal for cumulative stream flow. We don't, that doesn't change a whole lot. This time of year, it kind of flattens out, but we'll have to see how that responds with the early snow melt. As you can see in 2019, there certainly was, it flattened out a lot more and much earlier. So we'll have to see how things respond there. Shifting now to groundwater, we have these two reference groundwater wells. I've shown here underneath, I haven't shown this before, but this you can get from the USGS water data for the nation pages, just showing the aquifers, different types of the major aquifers in the state. So these reds being igneous and metamorphic rock aquifers where the Davenport well is located, and this light blue being unconsolidated and semi-consolidated sand and gravel aquifers. So just keep that in mind. But these the wells, depending on the depth, can go down to this Davenport showing the basalt here. So as we normally view this dark blue line being the current year, this little kind of dotted dash line being the median, and this kind of tan thinner line being last year. Looking at current groundwater levels at Davenport, we're quite a bit higher than last year, but just below the median at this well. Looking then at backing out a little back to 2015, we've been watching this kind of rising trend that might mimic that rise from after the 2015 year drought. And kind of came back down, and now we're kind of on this, what seems like a rising trend, with current conditions showing again that below median and above last year's conditions. Now we'll head a bit south to the Whetstone well, not far from Walla Walla. Sorry, this key is overlapping here, the current water, current conditions here being much below normal than last year and median at the Whetstone well. And zooming out again, going back to 2022, or beginning of the 2023 water year, we see that this is not quite a similar, a pattern like we see at the Davenport well, but we do see that we made quite a big dip this beginning of this year. That's pretty close to the beginning of 2023, excuse me. And we kind of been on a little rising trend since then, but still sitting below last year in median. So putting the monthly groundwater conditions into context of these percentiles, the Davenport well showing that April and May so far being normal, and then Whetstone well being below normal to much below normal conditions in April and May. And just as a summary on the 7-day average stream flow at the index gauges being above normal at American River and the Nooksack River, below normal to Quinault, Puyallup, Hangman, and Walla Walla, and much below normal and record lows, much below normal Chehalis record lows on the East Fork Lewis, and those being basically the southern part of the state, and the eastern part of the state being below normal in the west. Just having some of these higher flow conditions, which is probably really fed by the earlier snow melt and recent warming. Monthly average groundwater conditions in April and May at the Davenport well were normal. Whetstone well much to or below to much below normal. And then just to kind of put some of this into context, the monthly average area-based runoff that we saw from the hydrograph and the watershed maps with the very low in Roosevelt Basin, but there we have some highs in the east of the Cascades and north central Washington. And then the 7-day area-based runoff showing us that we were kind of below normal in this orange here. And again, these peaks in March and April showing kind of what's reflected in the map of above normal conditions. And then the cumulative runoff so far being normal for the water year. And that's all I've got for you. You can take any quick questions if you have them.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick. Any quick questions for Nick? All right. Well, if anything comes up, we will have more time. Before we go to Amy, I'm going to share a couple of Teresa's slides from the Borough of Reclamation briefing on Monday. And again, Teresa Hauser is our new representative from Reclamation, but she could not make it today. But I have her slides from the Reclamation briefing on Monday, and all of these will be posted on the WASAC website by next week, but likely earlier. But I'm going to share a couple of updates from Reclamation. And again, this is focused on the Yakima system and the Yakima Basin that are currently in the declaration. But I just want to highlight a couple of things after this very dry May and impacts for Yakima as well. So again, for 2025, we see this is a comparison that Reclamation does for historical storage. And this is for the years compared going back to 1971 for many of the years, although not quite everyone, but close to it. And so we see here 2025 over here on the right. Steph is not the lowest, but it's definitely one of the lower years. And Reclamation is now saying that storage at this point in the year is 8th lowest since 1971. So 8th lowest. It's no longer 5th or 3rd lowest, but still not great for irrigators and fish and others in the Yakima Basin. And then Karen talked about the CPC forecast already, but and this is one that folks can stare at on their own, but I just want to highlight, this is just showing for the different reservoirs. Each of these acronyms is the different reservoirs in the Yakima system, showing the forecast for the water year 25 from now May until September 30th. And many of them are at concerning levels in terms of being in the 60th percentages or low 70s. While there are some that look better, but majority of them are not looking great. And this is what I want to particularly highlight that some folks may be tracking if you missed the reclamation briefing on Monday. But with reclamation for the Yakima system, always the big news is the adopted forecast for those that have the pro-ratable water right. And back earlier in March, there was an initial estimate of they had 48%, and then in April they said 58%. But now, as of Monday, Reclamation is saying for those pro-ratable water users, they will be seeing 51% of their usual water allotment between May and September. So 51% also not great for irrigators and other impacts on fish in the Yakima system basin. But just wanted to highlight this as this is back closer to March and has gone down from the initial forecast they gave earlier in April, from 58 now back down to 51%. So those are the major highlights over from Reclamation in terms of the newest pro-ratable total water supply available percentage. But all of these slides will be posted on the WASAC website as well. And with that, I will pass it over to Amy Burke with the Northwest River Forecast Center.
All right, thanks, Caroline. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so this is us, and we've had some turnover. Tanya will be filling in for the hydro responsibilities for Portland, and Charlotte for Robin in Spokane, who have recently departed. And we've got Brent and George both on this call if you have questions for their specific areas. And jumping right in, yes, just to reiterate this, we had a dry April and dry start to May for most of the basin and certainly for all of Washington. Dry and warm, I might add. So the middle graphic, I'm just revisiting the peak SWE. So the percent of average that we saw in terms of percent normal snow water equivalents at the SNOTEL stations around the state. And you can pick out this pattern that Caroline showed, which was kind of some higher than normal numbers trending into lower than normal numbers here in the mountains east of Seattle. I've been saying that all year. And in general, we saw this trend where we had higher than normal numbers in the southern portion of the Columbia Basin. So, you know, some of that water does flow through Washington, but the Washington mountains generally did not see that trend, lower than normal numbers. And then on the far right, we have runoff as of yesterday, expressed as a percent normal, and this is since the beginning of the water year, October 1st. So some oranges and yellows peeking through here. And these greens, I would say a lot of this is being sustained by snowmelt currently. So we did see, we'll look at the changes since last month in a bit. So yeah, looking ahead to the next 10 days of precipitation forecast, Karen was curious about this, and as she was expressing curiosity, I was quickly updating this because this is down even from yesterday. So these are the numbers as of this morning. The left-hand graphic is showing what normally falls in this 10-day period. And you can see it's not nothing. Like this is, we're normally still getting rain this time of year. But the middle graphic is showing the actual inches forecast to fall in the next 10 days. So you can see sort of the perimeter of Washington is expected to get something. This center white portion here is expected to get nothing. And then all of that is expressed as percent normal on the far right-hand side, or percent of climatology. So this red, especially this deep red color, is indicating much lower than average numbers. In general, this precipitation is expected to fall the 12th, 13th, and 14th, the majority of it early next week. That'll, you know, the forecast will come into focus as we get closer to that date. But it's not much, as I think Caroline said, no miracles here. Yeah, but a little bit expected to come still. And certainly no snowpack building expected out of that. So looking at what I showed last month for runoff, That's the observed runoff since October 1st through current, as well as our seasonal forecasts, which start April through and go through September. So sort of looking at 2 different time periods of the volume of water expected to flow through these rivers on the right-hand side and already measured having flowed through these rivers on this far left-hand side. And I just wanted to flip back and forth between what I showed last month and what we're looking at today, as of yesterday. Sorry, this right-hand side is mislabeled. That's supposed to be yesterday. So as I flip from last month to this month, I see a pretty remarkable degradation in all of these forecast numbers. We see a lot of greens, yellows turning to oranges here in this middle graphic, and we see a pretty stark increase in the number of red points on this far right-hand map, which shows the ranking. So just focusing on the numbers from what we know of as of yesterday. Runoff is here on the left, so you can kind of compare what's happened to what we expect happen during the April through September period, and we're already a month plus into this period now. So lots of oranges here on the west side, and certainly oranges everywhere, indicating below less than 75% of the expected volume for this period, which I believe is the threshold here. And then we've got some red highlights there on the far east. This right-hand graphic is expressing the same information, but ranked in descending order. So these 5s, 6s mean the 5th or 6th lowest volume expected for this. Most of these have a 77-year record, roughly. So all told, take-home messages from this are that forecasts for the April through September period have dropped significantly since last month, owing to the dry spell that we're coasting on right now. And then ranking the forecast volumes against their own historical records is really helpful tool for highlighting concerning areas, and see a lot of those reds across the state. And then looking at how some of the monthly volumes have come in and are forecast to come in, just highlighting some key water supply points around the state. This top point is the Skagit River and Mount Vernon. And we see a lot of the same patterns across all of the west side points I'm going to highlight here. So deficits, the y-axis or vertical axis is depicting the volume in kiloacre feet, and the blue bars are the observed. So I'm comparing those to the green diamonds, which are the 30-year normal. So we see deficits forming pretty much everywhere on the west side in November, even in October, especially as you trend to the south. Big deficits forming in January and February in all the west side points that I looked at. March, we didn't do too bad. We got a little bit of precipitation in March, and I believe some of this was driven by melt as well. But for a lot of points around the state, we had slightly higher than normal March volumes flow. But you can see that's not the case everywhere. So Dungeness and the Chehalis both didn't quite make it to normal for March. April, again, slightly higher than normal in some places. And I was pleased to see that our forecast for the month of March, for the month of April, did pretty good. So we had forecast slightly higher than normal volumes for these points, and that is what happened. But the forecast from here on out, these yellow box and whisker plots, you see interquartile range of them. The yellow box does not reach or exceed the 30-year average for any of these that I've seen. So we are expecting to accrue large deficits during the melt season, owing to both the lack of snow melt coming out of the mountains and the dry months that just happened. So I put April and May up here just to remind us what's currently driving, which is a bunch of red on the maps. So take-home messages here are that runoff was below normal in January and February for many of these points. March and April runoff was a mix of higher and lower than normal runoff, and the monthly runoff for the remaining months, May through September, is forecast for below normal. East side, we see some of the same patterns. So we see this big march here at the Yakima and at the Walla Walla, but we still see a lot of deficits forming throughout the whole water year for a lot of these points. April is starting into the big peak season. For most of these points on the west or the east side, May is the big month, and you can see that we are forecasting below normal volumes for May and indeed the rest of the season. The Yakima here's got a bump in August and even September that I would take with a grain of salt. I'm not sure what's driving that. So yeah, I would expect lower than normal volumes again for the remaining months of the water supply season. So main takeaways from today are that April and May have been warm and dry compared to normal. April runoff was a mix of above and below normal, and that was definitely snowmelt driven. We certainly didn't have precipitation inputs really to speak of. It's not that it didn't rain, but we didn't get big pulses in the rivers from it. Precipitation forecasts for the next 10 days are below normal, and the April through September river forecasts are lower than normal and dropped significantly since last month. That's what that last sentence is supposed to say. I can take any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. Appreciate those comparisons. Any quick questions for Amy?
I did have an extra slide showing the downward trends recently in the evolution forecast. I'll leave it there.
Great. Amy, can you highlight, just walk people through which areas are being shown here? So I think for some people with having a bunch of these on there, it might be hard to see the labels of the titles.
Yeah, sure. So the left-hand row is are those key water supply points on the west side. This top one is the Skagit, the Dungeness, and the Chehalis. I will note, since I'm on it, that the Chehalis is quite rain-driven, so it has very little skill early in the season, really until you get into the forecast period. You don't see this forecast move, but you can see it dropping as it does not receive, the basin does not receive precipitation in these months. It just starts to plummet. And we see that deep decline in all of these. So on the east side here, we're looking at the Okanagan at Mallet. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. The Yakima here in the middle, and the Methow near Pateros here at the bottom. I will also note that these upward trends here on the Methow are due to us adjusting our internal modeled soil moisture states. So it's not like it got input, and we just adjusted our forecasts. And then down here also on the east side, the Walla Walla trending down during the month of April.
Great. Thank you, Amy.
Sure.
Any questions for Amy? Okay, we will take a 5-minute break and then come back and with the committee members, presenters here, have a discussion around the hydrologic threshold for the advisory areas and potentially some other areas about whether current conditions warrant bringing them into the drought declaration, or really for WASC making a recommendation for ecology to go through the next steps in the drought declaration process. So with that, I'm going to stop